Hello, my name is Rick Coe, and I work for both Statistics for Sustainable Development and C4 Aircraft. I'm going to share a few thoughts that might help you in your student research project. My aims in this short talk are to prompt some thinking about models in research, particularly the statistical models you use when analysing data. The subject can get very deep and technical, and I want to keep it practical, pointing to things that you can do to improve your research. You, as students, need to learn good research habits now rather than learning things that you have to unlearn later, and I hope this talk will be part of that process. My suggestions are based on years of working in research in agriculture, agroforestry, and agroecology, and also working with students. You will often hear of models in research and when analysing your data. One well-known book explained that models are analogies that represent important parts of the system. I agree, but I don't find it a helpful explanation of why they're important. The Science Learning Lab website that there are references to on the screen has a good simple introduction that starts by saying a model is a representation of an idea, object, or process, and I think that's more understandable. Here's a model, a small analog of a larger object. It's a model of a car based on a real one. Is it a useful model? It would be useless for trying to predict the maximum speed of the real car or how far you could drive it before it needs an oil change. But it's quite good for explaining what it means to have a wheel at each corner or how the back door lifts up. Without getting into philosophical discussions about what a model is, we can say that practically models can be useful. They have roles to play in exploring a subject, understanding and explaining what is happening, making predictions about what may happen in a new situation, and testing hypotheses. Crop production is a central part of agriculture, so many scientists have produced models of crop production. One approach is to describe the process of photosynthesis using carbon dioxide and radiation to produce biomass. This can be based on the detailed physiological understanding of photosynthesis and plant growth that science now has, and aim to have a model that is aligned with what we know. In real plants, that production may be limited by water or nutrient supply. So a different model is needed if we want to understand the effect on crops of water limitation. And crops in a real field are also affected by weeds, by pests and diseases, for example. So yet another model is needed to describe those. None of these crop models that I've highlighted on the screen involve people or animals or other parts of the farm system that influence crops in practice. So scientists that are interested in those aspects of agriculture sometimes develop models that include components of the farm system. At first glance, this diagram of a farm system that's on the screen, it looks comprehensive. You don't have to stare at it for long to see things that are not represented but will sometimes be important. For example, labor is an input to production in this model, but the money that would buy things like seed and fertilizer is not represented. This is not a criticism of the model. I'm simply pointing out that a model of anything only represents or describes some aspects of it. So we'll need different models for different things that we're interested in. These on the screen are examples of conceptual models. They describe the components and processes you're thinking about, but they don't describe the detail of how these things work. Your research has to be based on an explicit conceptual model. For example, if you're studying crop production, are you using concepts in number 1 or number 2 or number 3 here, or perhaps a number 4 which isn't shown? Without deciding that, you can't decide what processes, factors, or variables you're going to investigate and measure. As a student carrying out research, you will certainly come across models when analysing your data. You've probably been taught about statistical models, and a lot of statistical analysis you do involves using models of some sort, even if that is a bit hidden. This author said, "We combine models and data to answer questions," and that's a good way to think about much of the statistical analysis you do with your research data. Combining models and data can make a general model specific so that we can evaluate it by comparing the model with observations. If the model is found to be adequate, we can then use it to make specific predictions and answer quantitative questions. How much or how often does something happen? Let's look at a simple example. Here's a bit of data from an agronomic experiment. The experiment compares the effect on maize yield of adding different levels of phosphorus fertilizer, and it was done at 2 sites. I actually made up this data in order to keep it simple and illustrate a point. Just looking at the graphs shows that the crop seems to respond to increasing phosphorus. That happens at both sites, but the situation is different in the 2 cases. For example, the yield without fertilizer is much lower in site number 1 than in site 2. Probably one of the first statistical models you learned about is one that proposes a straight line relationship between an input, here the phosphorus fertilizer, and output of crop yield. This is the simple linear regression model. I can think of a scientific basis for that model. It involves the assumption that phosphorus is the only limiting nutrient and the concentration of phosphorus in the crop is constant. The result of fitting the model to the data is drawn on the graph, and it's clear that the model is not a very good description of the data. The observations don't support this model, and if we try to use this model, we might get misleading answers. However, that simple straight line model might still be useful. If we have questions about the initial response to low phosphorus inputs, then we can use the model only at the left-hand end of the graph, and it seems acceptable. Results of using the model quantify the striking differences between the sites. The yield with no added phosphorus at site 2 is nearly 3 times that at site number 1, and the response to adding P is far higher at site 1. If you are the researcher here, those facts should raise questions about why. What's the difference between the sites that gives rise to such a large contrast in maize yields and response to phosphorus fertilizer? So in that sense, this very simple model might be useful. Now I'm using a different model, one that covers the whole range of phosphorus values studied. It's more complex than the straight line, and it's a non-linear model that approaches a maximum yield. The details at the end of the presentation if you're interested. It seems like a better fit to the data, and it can help answer questions that cannot be answered with the previous model, such as what is the maximum yield that can be obtained by adding phosphorus. But notice something else as well. Results we obtained from the previous model are now different. That yield at low phosphorus input, we get a different estimate from this model than the previous one. The answer to a question such as what is the initial response to fertilizer depends on which model we use. Here are 2 quotations, both attributed to the great statistician George Box. The first, statisticians and other scientists, like artists, have the bad habit of falling in love with their models. He meant that it's easy to get used to using a particular model and assuming, perhaps without thinking too carefully, that it is appropriate for all problems you work on. If you make that mistake, you will use inappropriate models and fail in your objectives. It often applies when you're analysing your data, as you use the models you know about rather than finding models that are appropriate. The second, all models are wrong, but some are useful, is a reminder that models are not the truth, but if chosen well, can be useful. The simple statistical models of crop response to fertilizer that I showed are not comprehensive descriptions of what we know about the subject, but they can still help in answering particular research questions. Using and developing models well in research is not something you can learn once and then know everything about. Instead, it's something that you will learn slowly by experience. There are habits you can adopt that will help this learning. As with other aspects of research, it's best to start these habits now as you begin learning about and doing research, rather than trying to pick them up later. The first is to read widely about your research area and think carefully about the models being used in the research that you read about. Sometimes authors will be explicit about the models, and at other times you'll have to figure out what the implicit or hidden models they're using are. Secondly, write down an explicit conceptual model for your research. When it's written down, it's easier to reflect on it, you can show it to others and get feedback, and you can update it. Thirdly, think carefully about the statistical models you're using as you analyze your data, and make sure that they make scientific sense. For example, they should be consistent with your conceptual model. If you're interested, the slides for this talk, as well as lots of other resources, can be downloaded from our website at statsforsd.org/resources. Thank you very much.